It's my great pleasure to have Leo Marcelis here. Leo is a leading light, has been for some time, no pun intended in talking about light, in the world of horticulture and plant and product physiology. I think Leo kind of started off at the same time as me. He did his PhD at Wageningen in fruit growth and dry matter partitioning in cucumber. That's 30 years ago, Leo.
Time flies.
We both come a long way since then. Leo is, if you look at vertical farming, controlled environment ag, Leo's name is invariably associated with it. And his background has been tremendous on this. And he's a nice guy, which is really good. So today he's going to talk to us about beyond the hype in vertical farming, something we've been experiencing or involved in the same thing. So I'm going to talk about this and the colourful life of plants. So Leo, it's all yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Derek, and nice to meet every people here online. And thanks for the invitation to give a presentation so indeed about vertical farming, about the hype, what's next, and then about mainly focusing on the plants. And I assume you see my screen, so if there's something wrong, then just shout. Yeah. Okay. Starting, maybe it's good to look a little bit back in time, in the history. Well, what you see now is a picture of first some sort of greenhouses in the Netherlands about 100 years ago, and then let's go very quickly. This is probably about 1950, 1960. We see a little bit more technology coming in, and that is in fact what has happened over the years. More and more technology came in, and now here you could say, well, this is already a bit more modern type of greenhouse, and over the years we see more and more control over the production level, more technology to control the crop. And if you think about that, then you can also understand the vertical farming, or let's say the high-tech indoor production. I consider that as the ultimate level of control of the production. Well, and here you see just a few pictures, but probably you're all aware of this, so I don't need to say much about this, but just as a sort of introduction. So the previous one was a bit more warehouse type of things. It could also be more like shipping containers, or there are also examples of in supermarkets where we have some smaller cabinets. So vertical farming, if I talk about vertical agriculture, I'm thinking about growing crops in buildings. It is on multi-layers above each other. It could also be vertical walls. And the most important is that it is a full control of the whole production process. Well, what are the advantages? Well, advantages are like extreme little land use, extreme little water use, very little fertilizer use. In principle, we can grow without pesticides. And what's very important, it can be anywhere. We are not dependent on a fertile soil. We're not dependent on the weather, not dependent on the outdoor climate. And as we can control everything, we can really make guarantees that we say, well, on that day of the year, we produce so many kilograms of a specific crop, and we have a defined quality. So these are the major advantages. Of course, there are also disadvantages, and we'll come back to that later. Well, what we did see over the past 5 years is a tremendous increase in investments. And I must say, this is a graph up to 2021. There was a strong increase in investments. And then if you look at just a few examples, how the investments were, and then it was often not just with a few million euro, a few $1 million, but tens and even hundreds of million euros that were invested. But yeah, then came the year 2022, and I think, well, up to then, I would say it was a bit of a hype of all the investments going up. But then 2022 then was a bit of a shake-up, a shake-out, just how you would like to call it. Quite a number of companies went bankrupt or were facing financial problems. Does it now mean that it is over? No, this does not mean that it is over, but it is, well, as what often happens with young industries, it goes up, but also at a certain moment you may get a shakeout, and then Well, but then the question is, do a number of them survive and continue and being successful? And I think that we are now a bit beyond the hype. We are now getting a bit more to the realism. Luckily, we see also, again, a number of new farms starting up, and there are also some recent examples, and this is not complete, but just to give a bit of an impression that, well, it is not all, they're not all in problems. There are also new companies starting up or expanding. And well, then I often get the question, what made now that from 2020 onwards, so many companies were in financial trouble? Well, what was very important, or what was a change, is the increase in energy price. So energy prices went up very rapidly in 2022, and vertical farming needs a lot of energy. It also usually needs a lot of investment. And that's why I wrote, well, money got more expensive. So to have an investment, to borrow the money, to rent it, well, interest rate went up, so money got more expensive. I would say those factors, I don't think that they were just determined, that they were the only reason that some of the companies went bankrupt, but rather the moment of the falling down. But I think these are important aspects, but it is not a complete story yet. But then maybe it's good to look at vertical farming, what works well, and then later on we'll also look at what works maybe not so well. So what works well, of all the promises, high yield, that is usually realized. High quality can definitely be realized. The very little use of the land, the water, the nutrients, that are usually well, those promises are made and kept. Little use of pesticides, in most cases also that works quite well and is realized. But where did the things not work so well? Well, that was mainly on the cost. So the costs are quite high in vertical farming. The product price is what I mean. Well, what if we grow vegetables? What is the price that we get for the product that we produce? Is that higher? Well, in some cases it was, but well, I put a question mark. I'm not so sure if we get a higher product price. The energy, I would say that's a big thing. It's a lot of energy use. And if you use that, then we have to think about in terms of what does it mean for sustainability? What does it mean for costs? So that's quite enormous. Also, usually there's a lot of labor needed. And yeah, what I see in particular in the vertical farming is that we have limited knowledge. It's relatively new. Yeah, you could also say we know a lot, but still there's much more that we don't know yet. But also that most of the companies are rather closed. So the knowledge sharing is quite limited. And that's a pity, because I think we need more knowledge to make the systems more efficient. I think if we would all share more the knowledge we have, we could do things better. And what I think initially, there were very optimistic stories. I often said already at that time, well, don't believe in fairy tales. And I would say, well, maybe that were initially just fairy tales, but let's now look at a fair story. Okay, some of the aspects to have a little bit closer. Labor. What we often see is that the farm scale is rather small. On a small farm, it's not so easy to automate. And that's what we often see, a lot of manual work. And besides that, what if I come at those farms, many of them, I see many people in the office. And then I wonder, hey, if there are so many people in the office compared to how many plants you are growing, yeah, that's then difficult to make a good business case. And then we also have to look at what people are needed. And the most important is that you have to realize we need different expertise. We need a grower, we need a technician, we need a marketeer, we need an entrepreneur, we need a financial expert, human resource management, and probably the list is not yet complete. And then we can think that everything can be in one person. Well, I don't think so. You need different people. But it's very important that we have all those different expertises together in a company. But for most, I often see that you need a grower. It's about producing plants. You need to have someone with the green fingers understanding the growth of the plant. And I think, and sometimes that is seems a bit forgotten. Then I hear a lot about AI, artificial intelligence. Is that the solution? Well, I fully agree. The future is in data, in sensors, in models, artificial intelligence. And then we go towards an autonomous production control. That's also where we put a lot of effort in our research on. However, to be realistic, at this moment, if you're growing plants, we also need an experienced grower. And then that experienced grower can make use of AI, can make use of the sensors, models that, or in fact, shouldn't make use of it, but we still also need that experienced grower, at least for the time being. And then energy. Energy is a big thing in vertical farming. And where's the energy needed for? Well, in particular for the lighting. That's most of the energy, probably 75%, something like that for the lighting, and the other for, well, overall climate control and some other components. How can we reduce the energy use? How to work on? Well, I think the most important is step one is we need to reduce the use of energy, and it needs to be a drastic reduction. And then once we have this made a drastic reduction in the energy use, well, the remaining energy that we need or that we use should be renewable energies. Well, in countries like the Netherlands, that will be mainly solar power, wind power. In some other countries, you will have also some other sources of renewable energy. And then as a first step, so the first to reduce energy, then you make use of renewable, well, then we are getting more sustainable. But we also have to reduce the cost further. And that is, we have to use the energy when it is less expensive. And the energy price is not constant. And in particular for renewable energy, in particular if it is solar power, wind power, the prices may fluctuate very much within a day or from day to day. If there is a lot of sun and there is a lot of wind, well, then there's a lot of production. Prices will go down. And then it depends also on the day of the week and the time of the day, where is the demand for electricity. On a Sunday, for instance, there's less demand for electricity than on other days, meaning that usually on those days, the energy price is cheaper. We can make use of it. Okay, so the most important is we need to reduce the energy use per kilogram product to be sustainable, but also to be environmentally sustainable, but also to be economically sustainable. I still think for reduction in energy use, there are a lot of unexplored possibilities. So we can do much, we can improve it very much to what we are compared to what we are doing now. And then it is about optimizing, finding the optimal lighting recipe. But it is not just that, there's much more than that. Well, I have not that much time today to discuss everything, but well, the first step is making use of more efficient lighting. Well, and over the past years, there was an enormous increase in the efficacy of the lamps. The LEDs, well, first we had other type of lamps, now we have LEDs. Also in the last 10 years, the efficacy of the LEDs increased a lot. But yeah, now maybe we are already about, well, often about 70% efficiency of the LEDs. That there's still some room for improvement, but we will never reach 100% efficiency. Theoretically, it's the theoretical maximum, but we will never reach it. So yes, there is some further increase possible, but it will be a bit limited. Still, then there comes the next step, and that is the energy. So from first step is from electricity to light. The next step is from the light to the production of the plants. And I really think that there's still a lot to increase. The light use efficiency of plants is far from its potential. And that is what you will see also in one of my next slides. And that's what we see here. So here we have, we compare the LUE, and the LUE stands for light use efficiency. In this case, it is the dry weight of a plant divided by the moles of light. Well, and here these are data, what you see here on the screen for lettuce. And we studied the scientific literature. We took papers where they had described all the growth conditions for vertical farm, for greenhouse, and for open field. Well, what we can see is that, well, as expected, the vertical farm has a higher light use efficiency than the greenhouse, higher than the open field. But what we can also see here, if you focus on the vertical farming, is that there is a big spread among all the different studies. Some had, in fact, a very low light use efficiency. Some others had a very high light use efficiency. Well, and there's a high variation is maybe not so surprising if you think, well, it's a relatively new production system, so we still have to learn how to grow. There's a lot of variation. One does do it much better already than another. What we also can see is on top, you see a gray bar, and that says that it's the bandwidth for the theoretical maximum. So that is the theoretical maximum light use efficiency of plants, considering on how many photons are needed to excite an electron and the subsequent processes in the photosynthesis. Well, that is more or less what you can find in the literature, this bandwidth on how many grams of plant could be produced per mole of photons. And then we can conclude a few interesting things from this graph. We can see, hey, there was already a study which was very close to reaching this theoretical maximum. However, if we look at the average value is far below the theoretical maximum. So meaning there's a lot of room for improvement, so we can increase this light use efficiency a lot. And considering the variation in the literature, it also suggests it is possible. But then we need to learn more about it, and then I'm sure we can increase this light use efficiency a lot. And if we increase the light use efficiency, meaning we produce more per mole of light, well, that will mean a substantial reduction in the use of energy per unit product. Well, here I've expressed it as dry weight, and maybe there are growers here in the audience and we think, yeah, I'm not selling a dry weight, but I'm selling a fresh weight, of course, but comparing it to a theoretical maximum, I would say that's in fact only possible with based on dry weight. But here we can see similar type of data, but now for the based on the fresh weight. Okay, so the first step is reduce the energy use. The next step is reduce use of renewable energy. Well, it can be solar panel, can be wind power, can be making use of biological material, biodigestion. And that's it. And then once we use it, then as I said, well, we have to use it when it is cheap. The electricity price, which you see here an example, well, can vary from during the day, can vary from day to day. These are big fluctuations. If you want to reduce the cost, we have to make use of it. And then we get the question, well, how to optimize these energy costs? But we also have to look at the demands of the plant. So we can keep everything constant in the vertical farm. However, it can be debated if that is the best. We can keep it constant, but the demands of the plant are not constant during the day, not constant for a young plant versus a mature plant. And then we have the energy cost, which fluctuate. Well, then we get interesting optimization study about when to use the lights, or in general, when to use the electricity. What is then also important there is continuously monitoring of the plants. More and more sensors are getting available to monitor the crop. Also to using more and more techniques are getting available to use a lot of data, to use artificial intelligence, and to combine all that information, and based on that, finding the optimal control of the crop. And then what I see as the future is an autonomous control, where we will have somewhere a control room where we are connected to vertical farms all over at different places in the world, where there are sensors in the vertical farm, and based on that information we control it. And maybe it's nice to mention that we have at Wageningen UR, a number of times we have organized the autonomous greenhouse challenge, and tomorrow and the day thereafter is again a next version of this autonomous greenhouse challenge, where a number of groups are competing to how to grow a crop in an autonomous way. And it is surprising that already in the first edition of this autonomous greenhouse challenge, it appeared already that a group using AI could perform better than a grower. So there's a lot of opportunities to come up here. Also still quite some challenges to figure out what is best. I focused my talk today about vertical farm, but I often get the question, well, what is better, greenhouse or vertical farm? To be honest, that's not the most interesting question for me. But I think it is good to look at both systems and to see what we can learn from both systems and then decide based on the context what is best for a specific company. But if you look at the greenhouse industry, in particular in the Netherlands, the cost price has been reduced to the bottom. Over the year, it has always been the growers have reduced the system such that it's as cheap as possible, a very lean and mean type of organization. It's really optimized over decades, and that's why they can produce so cheap manner. If you look at the vertical farms, they are full of innovation usually. They also adopt new marketing concepts. And now I think it is important to consider the different things, but then also see, well, what can we learn from each other? And I also see more and more coming up hybrid systems that there are connections, or that there is one company who has both a vertical farm and a greenhouse, or maybe where they are raising the young plants in a vertical farm, and then when the plants get bigger, then they are moved towards a greenhouse. I also get often the question, what crop should we grow in a vertical farm? Well, at present, it's not that cheap. So I think if something is not cheap, or if there are high costs, it's not a problem if you have a high value. So we should look in particular on products with a high added value. And I think also in particular, I see advantages for crops which are for fresh products, but maybe also pharmaceutical crops, nutraceutical crops. Also, I would think very much young plant raising is very suitable to take place in vertical farming. Young plants usually not that high light intensities are needed, so that makes it already a little bit cheaper. But young plants is also very vulnerable stage. Many things can go wrong, and whether you have 95% of all your plants successful, or 98, or 99, or 100% plants successful, is already a lot of benefit. These percentages can be higher in a vertical farm than in a greenhouse. For this crop space stage, it's in particular very important to have a full control over the whole production. But for which crops we could also I will try to make a simple estimation. It's very simplified, but just to make a comparison for two different crops, for wheat versus lettuce. And if you look at the physiology of plants, and where does growth start? It starts with intercepting light by the leaves, then we get photosynthesis. With photosynthesis, assimilates are produced, so then we get the dry matter production. Basis for growth. If you look at all the different crops, once you have an established plant with quite some leaf area, well, I think it's quite reasonable to assume that the total dry matter production per photon is rather similar. Even if I'm 100% wrong, I still think for the further calculation it does not matter. But I don't think you can find two crops which are a factor 100% different. And then from dry matter, we have to go towards the dry matter content, and we have to look at the harvest index. So the dry matter content is what is the dry matter ratio, dry mass versus fresh mass. We have to look at the harvest index, which fraction of the plant ends up, or the dry matter ends up in the harvestable product. Okay, so let's see here some calculation. Let's have a try. We have here lettuce and we have wheat. And I took some data from the literature. If you look at it, well, then how much dry matter can you produce per photon? Well, as a rough estimate, I would say 0.6 gram per mole of light. As I said, well, maybe I'm a bit wrong, but I'm not more wrong than 100%. Then the harvest index, the typical harvest index for lettuce is about 0.9, meaning that 90% of the plant, of the total mass of the plant, is harvestable product. Yeah, because with lettuce, we almost eat the whole plant. Yeah, we don't eat the roots, but that's only a small fraction. With wheat, well, we eat the grains. You have to do already quite a good job that you have if the harvesting is up to 0.6, so meaning 60% of all the mass ends up in the grain. Okay, so from that 0.6 gram per mole produced, it means for lettuce, 90% ends up in the harvestable product. In wheat, only 60% of it. And then there comes the next step, because we don't sell the dry product, we sell a fresh product. Well, what is the dry matter content of a lettuce? Yeah, that's depends a bit on the type of genotype and how it grows, but quite often we see about 4%, meaning that the ratio from fresh to dry mass is about 25. So for every gram of dry mass that we produce, we get 25 grams of fresh lettuce. Yeah, if we look at the wheat kernel, yeah, that is more or less only dry mass. There's hardly any water in it, so that's maybe a factor 1.1. So that's the big difference. But then we have also to look at the product price. If we go to the shop and we buy lettuce, yeah, you can find it very cheap, very expensive. There's a wide range. Here for the calculations, I took an average of about $10 per kilogram of lettuce. But yeah, if you buy wheat in a supermarket, it's extremely cheap. So maybe it's just $1 per kilogram. Well, now we have all the numbers, in fact, to calculate what would be the revenues per photon. Well, and what you then can see is that for lettuce, for every photon of light, the revenues would be 13 to 13.5 cent. For wheat, it is only 0.04 cent per mole photon. So here you can see on, yeah, the revenues for lettuce is extremely much higher than for wheat. And maybe now you also understand where I started, that I said, well, even if my calculations are at some places quite a bit wrong, it will not change the overall conclusion because it is a huge difference. Well, and then I put, of course, a lot of assumptions and also about what the price is, but maybe if you look at electricity price, maybe it costs well, 0.1 kilowatt hour per photo. So then you can do some further calculations. So the main message, I could grow any crop in the vertical farm. Technically, I can grow all crops in a very good way. The question is, what can we do economically? And then here, this is an example that shows, well, lettuce is in fact much more economically feasible than wheat. Well, then we can look at what crops to grow, what species, but also what type of cultivars do we need. And if you look at the plant breeding, I would say at this moment, there have not been really cultivars bred for vertical farming. There has been some selection, and maybe you go to a breeding company and go, this is a specific cultivar for vertical farming, but usually it is just based on a selection of, or selected from the existing cultivars. In the future, I see a lot of opportunity if we get real breeding for vertical farming, because here we can benefit from crops with different properties. Because breeding in the field, what is that? Well, that is breeding for heat tolerance, for cold tolerance, for drought tolerance. And then we need a large root system and for resistance to pests and diseases. So that's all very good. But all those tolerances and resistances, they come at an expense. They come often at the expense of growth. These are not so important in vertical farms. So now we can focus on growth, we can focus on quality, we can focus on a high light use efficiency. I should also say, well, in a vertical farm, in particular for leafy vegetables like lettuce, we often have tip burn. So we need also cultivars which are tip burn resistance. And we don't need a big root system. A small root system is sufficient. So then we don't need to invest so much assimilates in the roots. We can invest them in the shoot, in the marketable product. And if you get really the crops which are bred for vertical farming, then we can make a big step in the productivity. Oh yeah, so I see now, yeah, so the vertical farm, the quality, high light use efficiency, burn resistance, small root system. Okay, so this was the first part of my talk, which was a bit focusing on general aspects of vertical farming. Now I would like to take the opportunity to give a few examples about how we can optimize the light environment in a vertical farm. This refers to what I said, the colorful life of plants. Well, I will try to do that in about 20 minutes. If I had time, I could talk the whole day, so I can only make a small selection of some of the results. If you're talking about light, it is important to realize that light has different aspects. We have to look at the intensity of light. That's the amount of light per time unit. We have to look at the photo period or the day length, how many hours of light per day. We have to look at the spectral composition. So what is the color of light? Maybe even the direction of light. In particular, if you would have taller crops, can we have maybe light from the side, or can we have light from the bottom? And we should never forget that light also represents heat. And sometimes it might be too cool, but in particular in the vertical farm, it might also be too hot. Well, first of all, if you look at the color of light, so the color of light or the spectrum, well, then the plant has a number of photoreceptors. In simple words, you would say the eyes of the plant. We have a UVR8 sensor or photoreceptor that senses in particular in the UV light. Up to now, we don't see so many applications of growers using UV light in vertical farm. But then we get a very important group of photoreceptors which are very sensitive to the blue light. So that's like the most important, most well-known are the cryptochromes. And then we have photoreceptors, the phytochromes, which are in particular sensitive to the red light versus the far red light. Far red light is the light above 700 nanometer. Classically, it was assumed not to be photosynthetic active, but now we do know a bit more. But apart from photosynthesis, it can trigger many different plant processes. Okay, a first example that I would like to show is an example of a study that we did do on pak choy. And we wanted to know here, well, what is a good light level for pak choy? What is the daily light integral, the needed or a good daily light integral? Daily light integral, I could say that's the total amount of light per day. So that you see on the x-axis, and that's usually expressed in moles per square meter per day. And then those pak choy, we grow at different photo periods. And by increasing the photo period, you increase the daily light integral, or you can increase the light intensity. Light intensity, or indicated here on the slide, PPFD, meaning photosynthetic photon flux density. So it's another term for light intensity. If we first look at the orange line, we see 4 different points. Well, and that was for 4 different photo periods. The orange line, in all cases, the light intensity was 250 micromole, and then the photo period from left to right was increased from 12 to 15 to 18 to 21 hours. So what you see, if you go from left to right, the higher the daily light interval, the more fresh yield, really more fresh weight. Then let's look at the blue line. The blue line in all cases had a photo period of 18 hours. And then going from left to right, it started at a low intensity of relatively low of 170 micromole, and then increasing up to 290 micromole. And what we can see here is increasing the daily light interval by increasing the photo period was more effective than by increasing the light intensity. So what we can learn here from for this crop is you better have a rather long photo period to create a specific daily light interval. In this case, we went up to 21 hours. Maybe we should have gone up to 24 hours, but we did not do that because we got already information from many people who had said, well, we have grown them at 24-hour light, and then the pak choi does not grow well. And that's what we see in many crops. 24-hour light often is not a good choice. However, some crops may do well, but it might also be, apart from the crop, it is also cultivar dependent on what is the optimal number of hours of light per day. Well, in this experiment, we also measured many parameters on the plant. We looked also on quality and on the shelf life. In fact, we did not see here much effects on the shelf life of the plant. Then I would like to say a few words about far red light. So far red light, the light above 700 nanometer up to about 800 nanometer. With our human eye, it's hardly visible. Well, here we had lettuce grown in a vertical farm under red-blue LEDs, and then we added far red. And then you can see from left to right, on the left side, there was no far red applied. On the right-hand side, far red was added to the light. Well, so as I said, with far red, we get a higher production. We did do this as additional light, but then the question is, well, is it more efficient? Well, here we did do an experiment. We grew the plants, we grew the lettuce at 3 different planting densities. I do not want to say too much at this moment about planting density, but I would like to compare the crops grown without far red to those with far red. So the white bars is without far red, the red bars is with far red. And what do we see on the y-axis? The radiation use efficiency. This is the grams of plant produced per mole of radiation. So that is mole of radiation from 4 to 800 nanometers, so including the far red. And then we see clearly that when far red is added, we get a higher radiation use efficiency. So if you want to maximize the growth of the lettuce, well, then I think it helps very much to have some far red in the spectrum. Okay, now we go from lettuce, we go to tomato. By the way, this was an experiment in a greenhouse in wintertime. We used 4 different types of LEDs, and what we see on the x-axis, the percentage of red photons. However, I have to say the percentage of red photons was changed. Total light intensity was kept constant. However, if percentage of red photons increased, it also means that the percentage of blue photons dropped, the percentage of green photons dropped. So I cannot be 100% sure that it is due to the red photons, because when there are more red photons, there are less blue and less green. So it could also be because of less blue, less green. Well, what do we see here? If you first look on the left side of the sheet, on the left figure, we see on the y-axis the harvested fruit mass. And we see it for 2 cultivars, the tomato cultivar Melis and the tomato cultivar Brioso. If you look at Melis, what we see here is that the fresh mass was reduced. It was a high percentage of red photons. If we then look at the cultivar Brioso did not respond at all, so it really did not matter. Well, and I can tell you, we have also done similar experiments with other crops, and sometimes see an increase, sometimes see a decrease. So, wow, there is quite some variability among species and among cultivars. But then, going from left to right, on the right-hand side, it is exactly the same experiment, but now we do not, on the left side, express the yield as the harvested fruit mass. Now we express it on the right-hand side on the yield per kilowatt hours. So the gram of tomato produced per kilowatt hour. And then we see that both cultivars increased the yield with the percentage of red photons. So despite, also Melis, where maybe the yield dropped with a high percentage of red photons, yield per energy use, in fact, increased. Well, why is that? Well, normally red LEDs are more efficient in converting electricity into light compared to a blue or a white LED. So we have to look in the end also at the complete system to see what is most efficient. From tomato, I would like now to show an example of basil. So basil, well, high value crop. We still see that sometimes after harvest it's stored in the fridge. Basil should not be stored in the fridge, but for a number of practical reasons, you often find it in the fridge. But then you get chilling injury, and then you can get symptoms that you can, I hope it is visible on your screen. So those dark black spots, well, that's chilling injury due to a too low temperature. So for basil, about 12 degrees centigrade would be optimal, but if you do it at 5 degrees, which is the typical temperature of a fridge, well, you may get those black spots. Now the question is, can we grow the basil such that it is more tolerant to the chilling injury? Again, an experiment with far red. So what we did do, we grew the basil under a vertical farm, and then during the last week or the last 3 weeks before harvest, we added far red to the spectrum. Then the plants were harvested and kept in dark storage. Well, what we do see here on the y-axis, we see the overall visual quality. So that's a relative, well, visual score on how the product looked like. It was 100 at the start, at the harvest, so it looked all good. And then we see during the storage, it declines. But what we can also see, the line, the gray line, so that is where no far red was applied, that line was lowest. So therefore, there, the quality declined most rapidly. So what we see in this case, the far red light was good to make the plants a bit more resistant to the chilling injury. I also have to say, well, we also store them at a higher temperature. Well, then there is not much difference between, not much effect of the far red, but really making them more tolerant to chilling tolerance. And then we wanted to know also why, what makes it more resistant? Well, we cannot fully conclude, but at least what we see is that we see the concentration of sugars increased with the weeks of far red. So we see on the x-axis how long the plants were treated with far red, or no far red, 0, or 1 week before harvest, or 3 weeks before harvest. Well, we see here 2 lines because we grew the plants at 2 temperatures, a very low temperature. With the red line, that's a more typical temperature for basil. We think that the sugars play a role in the chilling tolerance, and interestingly, this effect what we see here of far red on sugars, that's also what we see in many other crops. Quite often, if we apply far red, we get a higher sugar content in, for instance, lettuce leaves or in tomato fruits. Well, I mentioned already earlier, in a vertical farm, we can keep all conditions constant, but we have to ask ourselves questions. Is constant conditions, is that the best? Is it the best for the plant? Because the demand of the plant is not constant. It may change during the day, it may change during development of the plant. And the energy prices are not constant. And here there's still a lot to gain in the efficiency of the whole system. Here, just one example of a dynamic lighting. This is an experiment that we did do on medicinal cannabis. So medicinal cannabis is typically propagated by stem cuttings. We take a cutting, put in the soil or in the rock wool, then it needs to root. So if we see here this graph, we see on the y-axis the percentage of rooted cuttings, and then when grown under different light levels, or light colors, I should say, you see 2 bars. The 2 bars refer to 2 different cultivars. So we have the cultivar CCBD and a cultivar white, the WR white, which stands for White Russian. Well, if you look at the first bars, then you see underneath, you see red, blue. So that was plants, the cuttings grown under red, blue light. So then after 3 weeks, we had about 40 to 60% of the cuttings were rooted. If you then go to the next bar, then you see around the red blue, you see a dark red circle, meaning that we had added far red. If we add far red, we got a higher percentage of the cuttings rooted in this case. I also must say, we have also, in a number of experiments, it was a positive effect. I must say, we have also a few experiments where there was hardly any effect. But here it worked. Far red promoted the rooting. However, if you look now at the figure on the right-hand side, then we can see the plant height. far red usually also leads to more elongation. And if you ask growers what type of cutting of medicinal cannabis do you want, yeah, they don't want to have a very elongated cutting. They want to have compact plants. So that's then a disadvantage of the far red. Well, you see here the first bars in the right graph, and you see when it was red blue light, plant height was here, what was it, 11 to 14 centimeters. Well, if the second bar where the far red was applied, we see much longer than it was, about 18 centimeters. That was by growers considered too high. Well, then we can go to the third bar. There we had only red light with far red, see also about 18 centimeters. And then we get the interesting treatment on the complete right hand side. For the first 7 days we applied far red, and then thereafter only the red blue. Well, first look at the percentage rooting that we see in the left graph. So for 7 days of far red, that did do the trick with better rooting. But then we should not do it longer than that. And I think that's an important story for everywhere where you apply far red. I see a lot of opportunities for far red, positive effects, but in very many cases you also have to look at the plant if you have to maintain it throughout the whole production cycle. Another example of dynamic light is what we can see here. It is already, we see here lettuce, a cultivar that can form purple leaves. They are purple because of the pigment anthocyanins. And if you grow them under a light color with not too much blue, as we can see on the left-hand side, we see a plant which remains relatively green. If in the light environment we increase the fraction of blue light, you get a more purple plant. You should also realize those purple plants, they form a lot of this purple color, anthocyanins. Anthocyanins, well, they absorb light. But it does not contribute to growth. So usually you see that purple plants do not grow that rapidly. So what can we do then? With this high fraction of blue light, we get a nice colored plant. We get a low energy use efficiency because the plant is not growing so rapidly, and also blue LEDs, usually they use a little bit more electricity. So what should we do? We should initially grow the plants under a spectrum with not too much blue. Then the lamps use less energy, the plant grows faster. However, at harvest we may want to have this nice purple color. Well, usually if you do 5 to 7 days before harvest, we switch the color, increase the fraction of blue light, we can still get the nice color. And in this way, we can combine to get a rapid growth with the desired quality at harvest. But meaning we don't have a constant spectrum all the time. Well, that brings me to the end of my talk, where we gave a few examples. Well, I started with a bit of a general talk of vertical farming, where we had initially quite a bit of a hype, then quite some companies get into financial trouble. And I think now we are back to realism, and I see a lot of opportunities now for vertical farming. Vertical farming, yeah, is it sustainable or not? Well, it is sustainable in many aspects. However, energy use is very high. The costs are very high. So that's also where in our research the priorities are on, in reducing the use of energy, making the whole thing cheaper. And with energy, it is reducing the use of energy first. Then the remaining energy that we use should be renewable. And then we should optimize it such that we use it when it is cheap. We also have to realize vertical farming is still relatively a new sector. It is new. It means also there are still many improvements to be made. We do know quite a bit about plant responses, but there's still so much to gain, so much more to learn. We can expect so much more if you would have new cultivars, specifically where the breeding has been for vertical farming. And then I fully believe that we're going towards an autonomous control of the whole system based on sensors and models. And also, in my opinion, it should be not, is it a greenhouse? Is it a vertical farm? No, it will be what can we learn from each other and can we combine it? There will be many links between greenhouses and vertical farms. And where we had maybe initially a lot of fairy tales, stories that were not fully true, Now we should go to a more fair story. And I think that can be still a very good story. And then I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Leo. That was a whistle-stop tour across a long area there, so lots of information to take on. So there's some questions we've got in the chat, but I'll tee up a few. I'll take the opportunity to ask questions as well. I think you didn't say explicitly, but basically we've designed the box now. How do we design the plant? If we want to design the plant and manipulate photosynthesis, that's not an easy job, and it's been a huge amount of effort going on globally. What do you think we're going to do there? What's the progress? Or could you update people on your thoughts?
Okay, I'm not sure if it could be because the first part I could not hear so well, but I think the question is, well, what with respect to improvement of photosynthesis, or maybe more in general on photosynthesis, on photosynthesis and on physiology. There's a lot of research ongoing, and that is in our lab, but also in many labs all over the world. And you don't expect that within a few years we have just, let's say, dramatic increases, but gradually every year, I'm sure we will make a few percent increase in photosynthesis, about what growth conditions are optimal, and then from photosynthesis also about, because you can have photosynthesis, but in the end you need a harvestable product. But yeah, it is a bit difficult to answer it in general. There is progress. I would love that we have much more cooperation, because I think we see also, of course, that people might do similar things. On the other hand, it's also sometimes good to have similar things, because maybe you see a result from one lab and you think, oh, there we see an improvement. Yeah, if another cannot repeat it, then it's also not so good. So to some extent, I also very much like that sometimes the research is repeated, but altogether, I think we are moving forward. But yeah, it's difficult to give a very concrete answer.
Oh, okay. All right, I'll go to some of the ones that are in the chat. So, an obvious one is actually, what's your opinion on designing microbial communities to put into these controlled environment ag systems?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would like to say, that sometimes people think that vertical farms are sterile. Well, for sure it is not sterile. It can be clean, but not sterile. Then about the microbial community, I have not so much experience with, but what I do have as an experience is, first of all, with microbials, you can gain a lot if there are stresses. Then the effects are strongest. Well, what we try to do here in the vertical farm to have very few stresses. So first of all, we should avoid all the stresses. Then I think expectations of microbial community are, in my opinion, much less than under field conditions with a lot of stresses. But still, I think about the whole microbials, we don't know that much. So I guess there's still a lot to explore. But at this moment, I would say it is very difficult to give a recommendation for growers to use them, and what to use them, and what would it lead. So I think there's still a lot of research to be done. But also I would always recommend, I also see sometimes just stories of that a product just has a strong effect. Well, I would just say, well, look at what is being compared. And sometimes, well, over the years, I got sometimes a bit skeptic, because I have had already so many people here that they wanted us to test something, and then we test it and we don't see much effect. Because if you do a test with a very poor control where the plants are not growing, you can easily get 100% yield increase. But if you grow plants already in a very optimized way, the benefits are smaller. So I guess there are a lot of opportunities for it, but still, knowledge is quite limited on those aspects.
Yeah. I would argue it's the same for using those systems outside as well, because usually these products, when you put them out into field conditions, the effect is either minimized or just doesn't happen. So So you kind of maybe answered this question. So there's Julian Pallier, apologies I pronounced that wrong, from Buenos Aires. He's talking about the importance of DLI compared to intensity, but he's then talking about playing around with, I suppose, dynamic spectrum adjustment. And you kind of touched that on the end. So not keeping the conditions the same, I think. So are you starting to play in the area about dynamic spectral adjustment?
Yes, I would say where initially we usually do our research with constant conditions, constant intensity, constant spectrum. Now at this moment, we're doing a lot of research on dynamic spectrum, dynamic intensity, and I think that, by the way, that does not only hold for our lab, but probably many other groups in the world also. So yeah, we did do, for instance, experiments with lettuce with variable DLI. Well, in general, what you can expect is that with leafy vegetables, what we usually see is if it's most optimal probably to start with a relatively lower intensity in the beginning and gradually increase it towards the end. Usually that's the more efficient. And I think the question is also, what about the color? Yes, it's also about the color, but also here I would say it is still all now, the research is starting up to give then the guidance for grower. What is now really the best, well, dynamic recipe? I guess it's a bit too early at this moment. I gave one very clear example, I think, on the purple lettuce, but just in general, I would say, well, we are just at the beginning of understanding all those opportunities, and I hope that within a few years that we can give a bit more concrete recipes.
Oh, okay. The questions are coming in thick and fast, so we'll go through a couple more because we still have you. One from Raoul, my colleague, and it's a really two-footed challenge of a question. So, what's a more practical approach? Improve photosynthesis through breeding, or just select varieties that have got better photosynthetic capacity?
Well, I think selecting varieties, that's good. That gives a very relatively rapid solutions or results. But I really think that we need specific breeding. And by the way, it is not just photosynthesis. So it can be for photosynthesis, but it can also be for leaf area expansion. And in the end, it is all the processes in balance. But as I indicated, all the breeding for the, well, we're now using crops which or have been bred for field, but in most cases it was bred for the greenhouses. But they are still disease resistance, resistances to stresses is an important component, and those traits are less relevant for a vertical farm. So if you would do the breeding, then probably we can find very different cultivars. So I really believe that in the end we need to have a dedicated breeding for vertical farming, but it will take a number of years. Usually breeding, well, may easily take 10 years before you have a variety which is substantially better. So yes, it will take quite a while, but I really think that's the way go forward. And in the end, it will always be the interaction between new cultivars or the cultivar in interaction with all the growth conditions. So it's also not one or the other. No, it is the balance between the two.
Okay, cool. Rob, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Leo. So, I mean, you touched on this again in your talk, but there's a lot of talk about feedback loops and automated vertical farming, etc., etc. Yeah. So what do you see as being the key technologies to provide that feedback for regulating growth on the fly, as it were?
Yeah. So I think now what you see is technologies as well. What sensors are we using for the feedback? And what we typically see is or using chlorophyll fluorescence, which is being used so as an indicator for the efficiency of photosynthesis. And we see making use of cameras, which just measure sort of the leaf area or an indication of the plant size. Besides that, I think also systems for weighing the whole plant. Or using it for transpiration could use, but these are the things what I see most. But still, in research, I think we have shown that all these things can work quite well. If I look at the companies, it's still quite a challenge to really make it actually work. To have a robust system, to deal with, if you have a sensor, then I think you should have a few sensors, because what if it's one of the sensors is off, and you follow with your control that sensor that is off, well, then it goes completely wrong. So you need also, well, I would say yeah, I really believe that this is all possible, but it's also still quite risky. So it's all, I would say, if you're really going toward, is it implemented in a vertical farm? Is in a vertical farming it's really you, a commercial farm at this moment using it? Well, we are just at the beginning.
Thank you.
Okay, one before we allow you to go, and it's the obvious one close to my heart and other people's here. What do you think about vertical farming and speed breeding? You think we've got a way forward in that?
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, because I did not touch upon the speed breeding today, and we're also doing quite some work on speed breeding. For those who do not know what it is in fact from seed to seed. So breeding companies, they will need quite a number of generations from seed to seed before they have a new variety. Even with modern technology, you still need a number of generations. Well, if you are, and then we can think also not just about the vegetables that we grow in vertical farms, but we can also talk about wheat or maize, where often in the field we can have one generation per year. In a vertical farming, you can have quite a number of generations per year, and that's that can speed up the breeding process tremendously for those crops. But for instance, we're also doing work on speed breeding of lettuce. Well, and then we can grow them at high temperature. That speeds up already quite a bit. We can grow at a reasonable light intensity. But we are doing now also research on different spectra, and in particular, far red helps very much to speed up the growth cycle of lettuce from seed to seed. And these, well, we have here quite some spectacular results that it can really be shortened, so the duration can be shortened extremely. So I see here a lot of opportunities for the breeding companies to apply that in order to come to to reduce the number of years before they can have a new variety on the market.
So bearing in mind all the problems we identified earlier on. Okay, well, thanks for that, Leo. We don't want to sweat everything out of you. We see you as a useful collaborator going forward, and hope to progress this much more. I would just like everyone to thank Leo in the normal manner, and hopefully we can see him again. Myself and Raman will be attending Green Tech, and so we'll be seeing many people. Hopefully maybe see you there if you're going next week. But thanks again. And the next talk that we will have is in the seminar series. We'll be looking at vertical farming and sustainable agriculture from Chung Wei Lu from Nottingham Trent University, and that's on the 19th of June. We look forward to seeing many of you at that talk as well. Leo, thanks again for a very fantastic talk.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.